everybody, and welcome back to the Crash Formula One podcast. I'm your host, Ian Mangan, and joining me is Lewis Larkham and Lucas Cochrane. Well, an absolutely action-packed weekend in Brazil. A clean sweep for Lando Norris, topping the timing sheets of every session. 2 poles, a sprint win, and a Grand Prix win. He extends his championship lead once again, but it was Max Verstappen that had everyone talking this weekend with his stunning recovery drive from pit lane to podium at Interlagos, while Oscar Piastri's slump still continues and his championship title looks further and further away. Guys, so much to get into this weekend. Lucas, I'll start with you. Firstly, how did you enjoy the Brazil weekend?
Oh, yeah. What a weekend to have a sprint race at. I mean, I've not always been the most vocal fan of the sprint race format, but if there's any track to have it, it's Brazil, and it does not disappoint. Both the race itself and the sprint were full of action and excitement. I mean, even towards the end of the main Grand Prix on the Sunday, I think we closed the race with the last 7 drivers or so behind Liam Lawson, all at sub-second gaps. So, yeah, truly, truly great times.
Yeah, it was literally jam-packed from start to finish. I mean, thrilling qualifying sessions, a thrilling sprint race, and of course the Grand Prix was just action throughout the entirety of the grid, which was really good to see. Lewis, I think we need to just get straight into it with McLaren, really. Let's start off with them. I mean, firstly, Lando Norris, he has done everything he needs to do to really wrestle control of this championship once again. He's extended his lead. He's just, I think, 1 point shy of a race win ahead of Oscar now. So he's really got a much more comfortable gap than he did heading into Interlagos. Obviously, it was about a 1 point gap heading in. I mean, he did everything he needed to do this weekend. And one, what does this say about, Lando's hopes for the next few races? But also Oscar's performance, this weekend. He really missed a lot of opportunities, I think.
Yeah, well, as we sort of touched on, Brazil always delivers, doesn't it? Conjures up some drama at Interlagos. And yeah, we had obviously the threat of a potential, rain and storms affecting the weekend. And we didn't even really need that in the end to still have an exciting and sort of pulsating Grand Prix. I think Lando Norris now has effectively one hand on the championship trophy. He's now 24 points clear of Oscar Piastri. That's, as you said, almost a race victory. And with 3 races and 1 sprint to go, that's quite a significant buffer given how tightly contested it is at the front between the 2 McLaren drivers. But yeah, from Lando's side, perfectly executed weekend. He scored the 33 points, maximum points on offer across both the sprint and the Grand Prix itself, in tricky conditions as well, particularly in the sprint race. It was obviously damp. There was wet patches here and there, as we saw with Oscar Piastri getting caught out. But Norris kept it all together and just delivered an excellent performance throughout both qualifying sessions and throughout both races. And you really have to hand it to him. He is delivering absolutely everything at the moment from that McLaren. Yes, McLaren had the quickest car this weekend, but he maximised it. And it was a performance worthy of winning a world championship, I think. There's still, obviously, as I said, 3 races to go, the sprint race included, still a lot of points up for grabs. And we've seen as well that it only takes, how quickly things can swing around. And 5 or 6 races ago, Norris was 34 points behind after having that DNF in Zandvoort, and we were all sort of assuming that was his title done and dusted. It only takes another sort of mechanical issue or a DNF, and it could swing completely the other way. But certainly momentum is on Norris's side, and he is just absolutely capitalising at the moment, particularly with Oscar Piastri's sort of form slump that's just continuing. But Norris has cut out those sort of errors that affected his early season, and it looks to be his title to lose at the moment.
Yeah, I think it's really, I mean, I in particular been quite critical of Lando throughout this championship, but that was a world championship weekend for him this weekend. He needed to maximize absolutely everything to really get back in control of this championship. And I mean, he did that flawlessly. I think, Lucas, interestingly as well, I was probably a little bit skeptical about Lando's performance considering the way Brazil went last year. Obviously, he had a huge advantage heading into the race weekend last year. Max had a massive grid penalty heading into the race and still managed to take the win that weekend and pretty much secure the championship. And I suppose for Lando to kind of look at that weekend last year and just execute such a clean weekend this year and just secure that, whether or not Max, still was a threat, which we will get into later on, I still think he did everything he needed to do, and this, I think, is probably the mark of the world champion that we needed to see from Lando throughout the season. Do you agree?
I kind of do. Could this be the end of the traditional Lando bottle that we used to be also used to? Yeah, I think so. It was a bit of a masterclass this weekend. He didn't quite have the full grand slam of leading every lap of the race, but it didn't really matter. He brought home the result. He still had a decent margin, even though on the team radio he didn't seem to be the happiest with the margin at which he finished in first. But even still, he seemed cool, calm, and collected, and pulled out all the stops in all 4 crucial sessions across the weekend. So yeah, it's really tough to fault him. As for Max, let's not discard him, of course, as well. He also put on a heck of a performance. But the fact that Lando didn't seem to feel any of the pressure, unlike perhaps Oscar may have exhibited this weekend, especially after that safety car restart. But yeah, pretty flawless from him. Very, very tough to fault.
Yeah, he had a few challenges throughout the race as well. Those yellow flags and safety cars and things like that as well. Lots of restarts, which he still managed to execute perfectly. So it certainly wasn't like the pressure wasn't on. But I agree, Lucas. He really kept a cool head this weekend as well. And I found that really interesting post race. He kind of said, "Yeah, look, we won. It was a great weekend. I'm really happy with it." But ultimately, he saw how quick Max was towards the end, and he was thinking, this is not a time to rest on our laurels. He's ready to kind of attack the next couple of weekends, which I think is what's really needed. Lewis, can we talk about his teammate Oscar Piastri? I mean, this is really interesting. It feels like these two have almost done a complete 180. I mean, actually, it's probably not really fair to say that because I think Lando's, results were better than Oscar's these last few races throughout the earlier points in the season as well. Potentially, obviously, there was kind of some ups and downs with Lando there too, but this has kind of been a consistent slump for Oscar now. I mean, what can we extrapolate from this weekend from Oscar's performance, and what does he need to do for the next couple of weekends going forward?
Yeah, as you say, it's almost like the roles have reversed a little bit. Maybe not to that quite extent, but we saw obviously, Lando was making some critical errors earlier in the season, and he seems to have got on top of that now. And now it's Oscar Piastri who we for so long thought was horizontal and had seemingly no chinks in his armor and could handle the pressure and wasn't letting it get to him, and just came out and seemed so unfazed by everything and was just delivering these consistent, fantastic results. And that's obviously changed in the last sort of 5 or 6 race weekends, and we've seen those errors start to creep in at critical time, and also sort of more fundamentally than that, just the performance hasn't been there, the pace hasn't been there. He's been struggling for several weekends now and has been quite far behind Norris at times. But yeah, everything that could be going wrong for Piastri at the moment, it is kind of going wrong for him. As highlighted again in the sprint race, he was actually having a pretty good race up until the point that he hits the damp patch, and that caught other drivers out too. He wasn't the only one to spin off and crash there. He was just the sort of first to come across it, I suppose. After we saw on the replays that Lando, I think, went over that curb and sort of threw a bit of water up that Kimi Antonelli reported over team radio. Obviously, we don't know whether that specifically was what Piastri hit or whether he'd just gone slightly wider on the curb. We saw on the sort of serrated edges of those of the curb on the exit of turn 3 that there was pools of water in there. So yeah, he's been a bit unlucky there. He's been caught out. And then in the Grand Prix, obviously the penalties really ruined his race. He's had a poor qualifying. He's down the field, and I think it kind of just sums up the position that he's in. That that kind of move on Kimi kind of had to be done because he knew he was already losing ground. He was already losing ground to Norris in the title race the last few weekends, and he knew he was behind him in the Grand Prix, having also lost points to him in the sprint race. So it's kind of like he needed to make that move, but it kind of screams of desperation a little bit, and that sort of sums up the position he's in now, that he needs to close that gap. He's running out of time. He needs to take risks. He can't afford to just sit back and settle with third or fourth place when Norris is ahead winning the race. He needs to turn that around. But it just seems that everything that he's doing at the moment just isn't working out for him. There's, perhaps an argument that it was slightly hard done by in terms of the size of the penalty. But yeah, it's just all going wrong for Piastri at the wrong time and unfolding. And it just seems that the title is just fading away from his grasp, when 5-6 races ago we were sort of saying he was the favourite for the championship, and it's just gone completely wrong. It was a really bold move.
It was a really bold move, obviously, into that turn one, and I think you're right, Lewis. The fact that he had lost those points in the sprint race, felt that there was a bit of a lunge of desperation there. But I mean, going back to what you said about the penalty, I mean, there has been a lot of talk, in the kind of following hours after the race, that this potentially was a little bit too harsh. I mean, I'd be interested to hear what you think about that. I mean, ultimately, it was a brave move. Whether or not he would have had the space to make that move, I suppose, is arguable. But I mean, I guess the issue was he locked up, and the stewards were judging on that. He had lost control of his car at that point. But I mean, was there an argument to say that Kimi could have given him a bit of space as well, or?
Yeah, it's a tricky one. It's one of those, again, that it could fall into the racing incident category, but ultimately the stewards deemed that Piastri was wholly responsible for the collision, that he didn't have his car far enough alongside Antonelli to sort of claim the corner. They also noted he locked up and was perhaps a little bit out of control going into the corner, and then he hits Antonelli. From Antonelli's side, he was saying that he was trying to leave space. He knew Piastri was there, but at the point that he's turning in, he's looking in his mirrors and he couldn't actually see where Piastri was. And then you've got Charles Leclerc on the outside. So it's 3 wide going to a corner that is that kind of bottleneck, as we've seen through the Center S's at Brazil, where these kind of incidents do happen. Ultimately, Piastri argued he couldn't disappear. And it's one of those, it's a really tough one to call. The stewards have decided to blame Piastri and hand him a 10-second time penalty, as well as 2 penalty points on his license. They argue that was appropriate and consistent with recent precedents, but again, it opens up that sort of debate around the racing guidelines again, and whether they're potentially a bit flawed, because we've seen it's so hard to judge. There's different circuits, different corners. There's so many different variables that come into play, but we've got these racing guidelines that the drivers are obviously trying to stick to, and in some cases, take advantage of. As we've seen Verstappen do that so well, how he will come out on the right side of these racing guidelines. We saw in Mexico, Verstappen didn't lock up, but there was an argument as to whether he was fully in control of the car when he sort of dive bombs Hamilton into turn 1. But he has the right to the corner under the racing guidelines, which is the view that the stewards took, that it was his corner. And in this situation, had Piastri, it was obviously a late lunge. It was brave, it was bold, but it wasn't the kind of sort of dive bomb that we saw from Verstappen in Mexico. Had Piastri done the same, he probably wipes out both Antonelli and Leclerc and rightfully gets hit with a big penalty. It wasn't quite that clear cut. He's obviously just punted into the side of Kimi, and then with Charles being on the outside, it's obviously ended up being a far worse accident. There's the argument as to whether 10-second time penalty is potentially a little bit harsh. Could it have been a 5-second penalty? The stewards have made the decision, but I think it just kind of opens up that debate around the racing guidelines and the potential inconsistencies and the flaws in those racing guidelines. And we've seen so many incidents in the last few races where the drivers have not been happy and have been disagreeing with the stewards' verdicts. Charles Leclerc even said after the race that he disagreed with the stewards and felt that Kimi Antonelli should have shared some responsibility by giving more space. And then you've got Kimi, who's arguing he couldn't see Piastri. He's trying to leave space. He knows Leclerc's on the outside. So he's doing his best to avoid the accident altogether. And it's just, one of those situations with the particular nature of that corner as well, that it's obviously gone wrong in this case. With that, it wasn't like it was a bad drive from Piastri in Brazil, and without that penalty, he ultimately finishes second, and the gap to Norris in the championship is suddenly a lot less, and it doesn't look as bad. And we would have maybe been saying perhaps he sort of salvaged that from starting where he did on the grid. I think this is going to be debated going into the next few races, and there's always going to be an incident like this that divides opinion, isn't there? And I think it again ultimately goes back to these racing guidelines and whether or not these need to be looked into and tweaked, because none of the drivers seem particularly happy at the moment, and there seems to always be a divide in opinion in terms of whether you've earned the right to the corner and how you've gone about doing that.
Yeah, it's been one of the biggest talking points of the entire season. I mean, Lucas, we've covered it in the past, but I mean, aside from that as well, Lucas, I mean, Oscar's performance throughout this weekend too. Obviously, the penalty kind of didn't ruin his race, but ruined his chances of kind of really fighting for a better position throughout the end of the race. But I mean, even his qualifying pace wasn't really there as well. I mean, there was a few flashes of moments throughout kind of main qualifying that looked like potentially he might have been able to snag pole, but then Lando just looked a lot more comfortable in the car, I think.
Yeah, so Oscar Piastri didn't qualify too badly. Let's not forget. I mean, he still ended up P4, which is granted out of position for what is the top team on the grid right now, but still isn't terrible. But Brazil has done a similar treatment to another team in that Mercedes were also split too, with Oscar being significantly out of place with comparison to Kimi Antonelli. His performance in the sprint race, again, we have covered briefly, in that he did get caught out by wet pats that Lando seemed to recover quite well from, and I'm not sure if the other two drivers behind him, including Bortoleto, who I'm sure we will touch on his sordid weekend later, managed to follow him into. But yeah, it just seems that he's been a little bit off piece just today, or rather this weekend and the last couple of races going. We at the beginning of the season we were talking about how he seems to be able to keep this cool head throughout any sort of in the heat of battle, be it, or in the heat of controversy, as it were. But I guess as we have gotten further into the season, these things have changed. And yeah, the pressure does ramp up as you get later and later into the season, and we're starting to see the gap widen up. So, as I'm sure we can all imagine, the pressure is mounting on him. And if it were the other way round, I reckon it might have a similar effect on Lando as well. It just so happens that Lando is the one in front and is as such benefiting from that pressure that is being placed on Piastri. So
yeah, I think you've touched on it there, where I mean, Lando is now, momentum is with him. So essentially, I think that is not helping Piastri's case. But I think also another point that you made, Lucas, is kind of the unpredictable nature of Brazil. We saw that split, as you mentioned, with the Mercedes as well in performance, and also with the Ferraris too. So, we did see a split in kind of performance between the teammates. So Interlagos did bring that kind of unpredictability, but I think actually that will probably get that in Vegas as well. I think that's going to be quite an unpredictable track for the McLarens this year as well, and I think that just further adds to the pressure on Oscar Piastri this weekend. So, I mean, I don't think that his title hopes are certainly not over, as you mentioned, Lewis, because, there's still sprint race to go, a couple of rounds there. It literally takes one weekend to just completely swing things, but Lando is cool, calm and collected, and he has his eyes on the prize at this point as well. I think because Oscar as well is so reserved, it is kind of sometimes difficult to get a read on him, but he has seemed kind of calmer in past races, and now it does feel like this is catching up with him a little bit. So, I mean, it really it does feel like it could go down to the wire, but I think next weekend could potentially see, it really depends on how both Lando and Oscar perform. If Lando has another weekend like that, absolutely flawless weekend, and there's one error from Oscar, I mean, it could pretty much look like the championship is his for the taking. But we need to get on to, of course, Max Verstappen. I mean, Lewis, what a performance from him in the Grand Prix. Pit lane start to P3. I mean, just incredible to make up that many places in a Grand Prix. He was just flying throughout, and I think ultimately if Red Bull had not messed up with their qualifying setups, he would have been in contention for the win this weekend. I mean, is that probably accurate in your mind too, Lewis? Or
yeah, there aren't really enough superlatives, are there, to describe Max Verstappen's performances at the moment. I think we're running out of them. I think that has to go down as one of his greatest drives, adding to an already impressive catalogue that just continues to grow season by season. Just underlining again, how, why he is arguably the best driver on the grid. I think, at the moment that is the case. In terms of, Red Bull were struggling, weren't they, this weekend? It wasn't the kind of performance that Verstappen would have been hoping for. They were on the back foot throughout, really. They weren't happy after the sprint race when Verstappen finished fourth. And they weren't, he wasn't happy with the car. He wasn't really able to challenge the front runners. And obviously at this point in the season, he needs to be finishing ahead of the McLaren drivers, both of them ideally, to be really having a chance to win this year's World Championship. So I think, Red Bull reacted to that performance in the sprint. They made changes. They gambled. They took some big risks with the setup changes for going into qualifying for the regular Grand Prix. Obviously, that backfired because we saw that both drivers went out in Q1, I think, for the first time since 2006. So a very rare thing for Red Bull to suffer. It just clearly those changes did not work for the car. Verstappen ends up P16. And then we've seen this kind of almost like buccaneering approach to the weekend from Red Bull, where they've just been sort of throwing everything at it and trying all sorts of different things to make it work. And you say maybe if they hadn't sort of made those changes, then he might have been on course to win. But ultimately, through the sort of gambling and through the risk taking, they ultimately found a solution for the main Grand Prix. Because I'm not sure he had the pace to otherwise compete. And obviously it backfired massively in regular Grand Prix qualifying, where he's 16th on the grid. But then those changes, they made wholesale changes to the car outside of Parc Fermé heading into the Grand Prix, which obviously meant he starts from the pit lane, put a brand new engine in the back of that Red Bull as well to give him the best possible chance to come through the field. And then he just delivers an absolutely outstanding comeback drive, again in Interlagos, just like last year, comes through the field. He had a puncture as well, let's not forget, early on in the race. Yes, the early safety car helped a little bit. He was able to make a pit stop early on, but he still had a puncture. He still was at the back of the field and had to come through. And it was just an absolutely, charging drive from Verstappen. And ultimately those changes that Red Bull made going into the main Grand Prix transformed his weekend. And, he obviously then delivers a brilliant drive to salvage third, which is, just about kept alive his title hopes, which is quite incredible, considering where we were a couple of months ago, that he's, was over 100 points adrift and seems completely out of it, and admitted that himself, and he managed to haul himself back into it. I do think realistically he's probably out of contention now. 49 points back, that's nearly 2 whole race victories, given the performance advantage of the McLaren at this stage of the season, given Norris's form and momentum. It would take a huge slice of luck for that to turn around in Verstappen's favour. And I think he's kind of conceded that over the weekend, that he's going to now need to rely on a large slice of luck. But all he can control is everything that he can control, and that is extracting the maximum from his car and delivering these kind of performances, which he's gone on to do. I think Vegas is the interesting one. That could be the sort of outlier out of the remaining 3 rounds in terms of, that could be the track that McLaren perhaps struggle at. We think, that Qatar and Abu Dhabi should play more to the strengths of McLaren. But Vegas could be one where they potentially have that sort of bad weekend where they might not be necessarily dominating out front. And, we've seen Mercedes absolutely dominate their last season, with George Russell winning in those cooler conditions. They seem to swing towards the Mercedes, and Ferrari have been competitive in Vegas as well. And Verstappen's obviously won there before, and he's just on it every weekend as long as the car gives him that possibility. So Vegas could be the sort of a bit of a lottery there in terms of perhaps there'll be a slightly mixed up result in terms of McLaren, but they seem to have built a decent enough buffer, with particularly on Lando's side, that he can almost afford a slightly worse weekend, maybe finishing second, third, or fourth, or something like that, and he would still kind of be in pole position for the World Championship. But I think Vegas is maybe the one remaining hope. Taking luck and DNFs out of the equation and potential mechanical issues, I think if we're looking purely at pure performance, Vegas is maybe the one where Verstappen could make the biggest inroad. But I do think it's probably a bit too much, to turn around now. He's really got a mountain to climb. So I think ultimately we'll be looking at one of the McLaren drivers winning this year's World Championship. But yeah, another incredible performance from Verstappen this weekend.
Yeah, I mean, it's almost so hard to top, what he did last year, and yet it was just absolutely thrilling. I mean, he was just cutting through the field. Lucas, one thing that I did want to mention was that they pitted Max, after he inherited the lead shortly afterwards around lap 50. He was on, kind of a used set of mediums, and obviously Lando was chasing down after pitting on fresh tyres. I mean, the argument was that potentially they should have left Max out to try and do the full stint and just retain track position. I mean, I don't necessarily believe that would have been possible, but I mean, do you think Max could have held on and just pushed those tyres to the end?
I think we place a lot of stock in Max for his driving ability, his ability to clearly cut through the grids like a hot knife through butter, and indeed his ability to extend and preserve tyres. But there are limits to these things. I think in order to give him the best chance possible, it wasn't necessarily a bad call to bring him in. We even had a point where he had inherited the win, and then Lando ended up pitting and coming out behind him. And when it came to that straight, he sort of just walked Max. So there's every possibility that, he would have just taken Max regardless. The McLaren car was clearly very strong this weekend, as it has been throughout most of the season. So I think in order to give him the best shot that they could, and they'd already gone the extra mile by replacing his entire engine, let's not forget, they want to maximize what they can from that. And if that means being a little bit more conservative with it, then I see that as an absolutely completely valid decision to make.
Yeah, they've kind of taken a few risks up to that point, hadn't they, Lewis, already? So
just to jump in there, I think they actually took the aggressive approach, and that's the approach that works best for Verstappen. Obviously, if they'd hung him out and left him on those tyres, maybe P2 would have maybe the win would have been possible, but he would have been fighting a faster car on older tyres. What they decided to do, as they did all weekend, was go aggressive, pit him for soft tyres and let Max do what he's best at, and that's coming through the field. And ultimately, it didn't work out. He couldn't get up to second place or challenge for the win, kind of ran out of laps in the end, potentially ran out of tyres. But I think they gave it, as he said over team radio, they gave it a try. And
and I mean, he was chasing Kimi at the end there as well, Lewis.
Yeah, exactly. He was, another lap or so, perhaps that move's made. He ultimately loses out on potentially 3 extra points there by not getting that move done. But at this stage, I think he's still too far back anyway. But yeah, I do think ultimately Red Bull went aggressive with their approach to the whole weekend.
Yeah, it's been really refreshing actually to see, they've kind of rebuilt that team a little bit. We often forget there's actually been so much chaos tied to that team this year alone. It's hard to actually sometimes remember that Horner was still with that team at the start of the season. So what Laurent Mekies, brings to the team is this, air of an engineer who's very cool, calm and collected. But you're right, Lewis, it was the classic Red Bull, like just going bold with the strategy. And, they aren't afraid to be a bit maverick in some of their decisions sometimes, which, when you have a driver like Max, I think it just always makes for really interesting viewing. But ultimately, yeah, I mean, the win of the championship is probably just, slipped away. But, as you say, Lewis, Vegas will be really one to watch as well. I mean, at this rate, though, P2 is certainly something that he can still definitely chase down, especially given Oscar Piastri's performance as well. So lots more to enjoy there going on. Now, we need to just jump on really quickly to Kimi Antonelli, a career best finish for him, P2 on the podium. I mean, Lucas, you touched on this briefly. An incredible weekend for the rookie. I mean, he had such a difficult slump in form there, earlier on a couple of races ago, but he has really turned it around. And I mean, it felt like he had the better of his, really strong teammate George Russell all weekend.
Yeah, it's quite actually, it's a little bit odd to see, to be fair. I wasn't quite ready for it this weekend. I mean, he's had a season of ups and downs, let's say, but if there's been one constant, it's that George has generally been the one to come out on top. And to see Kimi this dominant throughout the entire weekend, to be honest, both sprint race and in the Grand Prix itself, is really impressive from him. I mean, we were extremely hopeful at the beginning. We knew that Toto had placed a lot of stock in him as this new phenom, as we always say, Toto loves a project. And we've seen it pay off a little bit here. We were a little bit worried as well. I remember us discussing earlier on that he'd been dropped in straight at the deep end at what is a top-end team and just expected to perform. And yeah, that pressure got to him a little bit, but at this point in the season, he's not necessarily fighting for all that much, let's say. So the pressure isn't exactly as heavy as it once was. And for him to pull a performance seemingly out of nowhere like this was really, really impressive to see. Just making smart moves throughout the race, just staying cool and just walking it home to the end. Really, really impressive in both the sprint and the Grand Prix.
Yeah, Lewis, what do you think about his kind of recent resurgence? It's been much needed, obviously, a vote of confidence from Toto, keeping him on next year. But ultimately, I think we've all wanted to see Kimi pick things up a little bit over the last few races. And I mean, I suppose this weekend was as good as it gets for him.
Yeah, I think it ultimately just shows, it goes to show that he does have that talent that Mercedes saw in him. And the reason they fast-tracked him into F1 is because they saw that raw potential. He delivered in the junior championships and they felt it was time to put him in the F1 team. They also knew that, you know, they'd potentially lose out on him if they couldn't give him that race seat in the coming years. So there was an element of, you know, they didn't want to repeat perhaps the mistakes with Max Verstappen where they couldn't offer him that F1 seat, and he ultimately goes to Red Bull. They didn't want that to happen again. But yeah, he needed some support. He was going for a rough patch. He had a pretty strong start to the season. Then obviously that European stretch leg of the season was pretty awful and really sort of the lowest of the low for Kimi, and you know, even at one point Toto Wolff was actually quite critical of his performances. I think he said it was underwhelming after Monza, wasn't it? But you know, you've got to hand it to him and Mercedes. You know, they have supported him. Let's not forget they came into the season knowing that it was going to be a bit of a roller coaster season. They'd already kind of set the bar and said, we know how good Kimi is. There'll be weekends when he's electrifyingly quick and brilliant, and there'll be weekends when we're pulling our hair out. I think Toto Wolff said that at the end of last season, before this season even got underway. And that's kind of what we've seen. But you have to hand it to Kimi. He's gone through a tough patch. Pressure was on. There was, I don't think he was ever really at risk of losing his seat next season, but there was those question marks were occurring before he got that contract extension confirmed. That will have settled him, definitely. But he's managed, along with the support he's got from Mercedes and Toto Wolff, he's managed to navigate through that rough patch and he's come out the other side stronger. And, you know, it was a great performance all weekend. Great defense, you know, impressive drive to keep Max Verstappen behind and, you know, not make mistakes. I think he went slightly wide on that final lap in the midsection of the lap, but still managed to keep Verstappen just behind. And yeah, you know, P2 in the sprint, P2 in the Grand Prix. It was probably his strongest weekend so far, and to have beaten George Russell like on merit as well was really impressive, I think. Yeah, I think, you know, perhaps we look back on this weekend as a bit of a coming of age for Kimi Antonelli in F1, and I think, you know, this is a really solid base now, but he's got to continue that. He's got to build on this and not revert to the struggles we've seen, those rough patches, because that's the flip side of this. Mercedes were patient. They knew that he was going to have some tough spells, but they need to see, you know, this was always going to be a learning year with some mistakes, and that was accepted. But potentially going into next season where Mercedes are expected to be strong with the new regulations, and the pressure could be completely different if they're suddenly fighting for wins and potentially for the World Championship, then there will be that expectation and the scrutiny will ramp up even more. And then Antonelli will be less forgiven for having those scrappy weekends. But this is, you know, these last few weekends, he's been really strong and has sort of built that foundation to just continue to improve upon. And he's having a really strong end to the season. And, he's actually catching Lewis Hamilton in the standings. So it's sort of an interesting side note to the end of the year, is that he potentially could beat Hamilton to sixth place in the championship. Now, it's 20. I think he's 26 points behind, so that's quite a big gap. But as we've seen this weekend with Ferrari's double DNF, again, and Mercedes' performance, if they're strong in Vegas, could be another big chunk of points potentially on the way for Antonelli. So that'll be an interesting one to see whether Mercedes and Antonelli can leapfrog the driver he obviously replaced, in seven-time world champion Hamilton, and the Ferrari driver. And the other sort of side to this is that Mercedes have now moved back up to second place in the championship with this weekend performance, and Ferrari have fallen backwards.
Yeah, I mean, I'm sure everyone will approach that stat, Lewis, as you said, with very level heads if Kimi does overtake Hamilton in the standings. But yeah, I mean, ultimately it was a flawless weekend from him, really. And I think coming of age is a really good way to put it. It's interesting as well, Lewis, because he'd struggled throughout a lot of the European circuits, but he had raced on a lot of those circuits in, past series, and yet he comes to tracks like Interlagos and, he looked really, really comfortable all weekend. And I mean, there's all these unknown tracks, coming up now. He's never raced in Vegas, Qatar, obviously he would have been in Abu Dhabi, but it's going to be interesting to see. It's like you would think that would work against him, but it's been the opposite effect.
He's almost performed better when the expectation's been lower. We saw as well in Canada and Miami, those kind of performances too, where he was really strong, and then get to the tracks that he knows and in theory should be stronger at, and he's had a difficult run through there. Interesting.
Yeah, loads to watch there with Kimi, and I mean, as you say, it really depends on how he performs over the next couple of weekends, but this will be a much needed boost for him as well. And as we've said many times in the past, George Russell is no slouch to have as a teammate as well. We've argued that this is one of his best years as well in Formula One too. So to really put it up against him and win on merit was just spectacular to see, and a lot of potential there for the young rookie. Lucas, I'm going to come to you to talk about some Ferrari disasters. It feels like it just feels like a rotating door at this point where we keep coming back to it. I mean, what an absolutely disastrous weekend. I mean, where to even start? I guess let's start with the positives, I suppose, before we get into the negatives. Leclerc, ultimately, his pace wasn't too bad. In qualifying, he'd managed to put his car P3. He was looking decent in the race and he felt pretty confident. And I think he was so unlucky with that collision, getting involved in Piastri. He really was an innocent bystander in that. And I mean, going back to what we said about Kimi, the fact that he still pulled out P2 and he was actually involved in that collision and his car was pointed the other direction at one point. But I mean, his race was over immediately. Not a bad kind of, way to look at it for Charles, but he'll be walking away with that still very disappointed. But I mean, Hamilton as well, Lucas. I mean, what's going on there? I mean, the qualifying performance as well. It's just not there.
No, it's not, is it? It's disappointing to see. Going back to what Lewis was saying with Antonelli catching up to him is actually a very salient point now we look at it from the big picture perspective. But yeah, it's been really tricky. I mean, as you say, Leclerc really was just a victim in that turn one incident with Oscar. To be honest, it's a bit of a miracle that both Oscar Piastri and Andrea Kimi Antonelli managed to drive away from that incident just to begin with. Obviously, Charles wasn't so lucky and came away with some actually quite catastrophic wheel damage and a bit of a polo mint rolling away into the middle distance as well. It's just really, really terrible luck. I mean, we can definitely put Charles' race down to bad luck, but Lewis's, some of it does come down to merit, unfortunately. As you say, qualified way out position, which, judging by the rest of the year, isn't really that far out of character at this point, which is a bit of a crying shame. But the collision incident that saw him sort of eating his own front wing and just catastrophic floor damage, they tried to save it at first, but just really was not there. As he even said on the radio, he was missing a lot of rear downforce after that fact. And yeah, it's if it's not one thing, it's the other with Ferrari, isn't it? I mean, if it's not the strategy, it's a driver issue. If it's not the driver issue, it's the car. If it's not the car, it's something else entirely, or it's just bad luck. And it's really tough to pin it down to one or even two things at Ferrari throughout the entire year. I mean, it hasn't all been bad for them this year. They have pulled out some impressive performances, but even still, this race, completely sorted, definitely one to forget for them, and pretty tough to put down to a single thing. At least we can't say it was strategy.
Yeah, I mean, that's a very good point. There's lots of things there that went wrong for Ferrari, a perfect mixture of like driver error and also just the team not having it right. Lewis, I thought it was really interesting that Hamilton kind of was, I mean, quite critical of Ferrari at the end in his race. He said that he's been living a nightmare. Obviously, he did turn around and say, look, we'll keep pushing and I'm working with the team. But I felt that this was a bit of open criticism of how the season has been with the team. And I think he was trying to get at, like, look, I've had bad weekends too. It's not been the dream that I'd hoped it's been. But it certainly felt a little bit like, this has not been good for any of us at this point, and we need to change something as well. But ultimately, I mean, I think Hamilton had a very poor start to the Grand Prix and then just left himself open to those back markers, which then ultimately caused that collision. It felt like his race was over as soon as that happened because they kept him out, for a couple of more laps. But I think that Ferrari were ultimately going to retire the car at some point. I didn't think they were going to salvage anything from that race, but I mean, what's your take on the team dynamic this weekend and Lewis's performance?
I think nightmare is a fair way to describe this season for both Ferrari and Hamilton. Going over, there's always, as we always say, there's always that pre-season sort of build-up and hype around Ferrari, isn't there? But this season it was something different because of how they ended last season, and obviously bringing Lewis Hamilton into the team. There was even more hype and excitement than ever before, and no one could have predicted how badly this has gone on to be. The fact that Ferrari is still okay, barring the sprint race in China, which obviously Hamilton actually won. They've been winless this season, and that's just not good enough for Ferrari. And fighting for the scraps for the podiums occasionally, again, I've said before, it's not what Ferrari are here to do. So I think again, it's another messy weekend both for Ferrari and for Hamilton. I think ultimately the pace wasn't there, particularly on Friday. Sprint qualifying was tough for both drivers. They only just squeezed into SQ3 and into the top 10. The pace was a bit better in the race, the sprint race, that is. And then, qualifying, again, the car is on such a knife edge. We saw throughout the weekend, both drivers were struggling. Both drivers, I think there was one clip where both drivers following each other on track. I can't remember if it was in sprint quali or during practice, and they both locked up into the same corner. And that just sums it up. The car is a handful to drive, and they are fighting with everything they've got to keep it on track. And then they're usually 5, 6, 7 tenths off the pace and 7th on the grid or something. It could have quite easily gone the other way in qualifying. I think it's one of those where something always seems to go wrong for one of the drivers in qualifying. And I think that just underlines how tricky the car is to drive, how inconsistent, how unpredictable it is. Hamilton was struggling particularly for rear tyre grip and temperatures in qualifying, and he ends up, at the end of the day, he's only a tenth away from getting into the top 10 in Q3, and suddenly the outlook's a little bit different. It's fine margins, as we've seen with the field so close this year. F1's so competitive that sometimes even half a tenth can be a matter of positions on the grid, and Leclerc only just squeezes into Q3. And then finds this magic lap from nowhere, which we've seen time and time again. Leclerc is one of the best, if not potentially the best, over one lap in qualifying. We've seen that for years now with the amount of pole positions he's achieved, and he's gone and produced another incredible lap again to put it, third on the grid. Probably not where it deserves to be on pure performance, but there's so many variables and at play and influencing factors that can just swing it session to session, particularly with that Ferrari. But it's a hugely disappointing weekend for Hamilton. His race was really ruined on the first lap. He, getting hit by Carlos Sainz's Williams into turn 1, probably picked up a bit of damage there. And then, there's arguably a slight misjudgment from Hamilton when at the end of the first lap when he's coming to overtake Franco Colapinto, and it looks like there's a little bit of a jerk of movement to the left from Colapinto, but potentially a bit of a misjudgment from Hamilton. He clips the back of the Alpine and breaks his front wing, which then gets stuck under the car and does all sorts of damage to the floor. He has to come in and pit, and he's running last, with huge damage to the floor of his car, struggling to even keep it on track at times. We heard him over team radio coming over and saying, like, I'm going to crash if we continue like this, just because he'd lost so much downforce. And yeah, there was nothing really to salvage from that. I think ultimately the reason Ferrari kept him out was just in case he got that penalty from that, with the incident being under investigation with Colapinto, and ultimately he did cop a 5-second time penalty for that. He served that, and then they retired him. What was it, on lap 39 when he was running at the back? Had nothing to fight for. They might as well park it up, save the engine, save the car, because they were not going to get anything from this race with how much damage he sustained. But I think ultimately that decision was largely because they didn't want to bring him in, retire him, and then pick up a penalty which he couldn't serve, so that he would take that into Vegas, and then that would potentially ruin his Vegas Grand Prix weekend. A bit like what we saw, was it the Dutch Grand Prix, where he got that penalty that carried over to Monza. They're just trying to, sort of make sure that didn't happen again. He had no pace after that damage, so the race was done really from his point of view, and it just, again, another weekend that's gone by, and it's just been an absolute disaster for Hamilton and Ferrari. And I sort of thought maybe Brazil might be one of those opportunities for him to finally get that podium for Ferrari. I saw that as maybe being, before the weekends, maybe Mexico and Brazil might have been those opportunities based on previous form. But it's just, everything just seems to go wrong. And Leclerc was very unlucky. Whether or not, probably wouldn't have been able to hold on to a podium given the pace we saw from Verstappen, but would have easily, you imagine, would have finished top 5 had he not been wiped out, and he was unlucky there. But just really compounded a miserable day for Ferrari, for both drivers to retire. And they've now slipped not only behind Mercedes, but they've also fallen behind Red Bull and are now 4th in the Constructors' Championship, which, if they finish there, that is just an absolute disaster of a season.
Yeah, I mean, comedy of errors is really the only way you could describe that weekend overall. And I think, Lewis, you touched on something important there, that, Charles had a really great performance to get that car into P3. But given the nature of the track in Brazil, the amount of overtaking that happened over the weekend, him holding on to that position, I think, was unlikely. Not impossible, but still unlikely anyway. And ultimately, their pace was nowhere. They didn't really look that sharp in sprint qualifying either. They still managed to come home with some points in the sprint race, but just a very anonymous weekend for them as well. And then when the opportunity came to try and switch things up in the race, it just didn't materialize. So I think morale in Maranello will be absolutely on the floor currently, and as you say, Lewis, I don't think there's a huge amount for them to look forward to over the next couple of races. I don't think any of these tracks will really suit that car. I mean, look, they've had some decent results in Vegas in the past as well, so we'll have to see. Hamilton's not necessarily had amazing races there, but it'll still be interesting to see what can come about. But yeah, just a mess, and it certainly feels like there's no kind of way out of it anytime soon. So I think they'll just be looking to just get this season over with. The fact that, as well as you said, they just wanted to get the car out and just serve that penalty and then get back in, save the engine. It's kind of indicative of the rest of the season. It's like, let's just get through these next couple of races and see what happens. And if they keep slumping down the championship order, it's just embarrassing at this point, really. Like,
Hamilton even said after qualifying, didn't he? This is just about having fun now, but he's not even.
There's a bit of a Kimi Raikkonen response from him, I guess.
Yeah. It's an interesting way to say fun as well. I don't think it's been that much fun for him either, if that's what his definition of fun is. So, yeah, just another tired weekend for Ferrari. So we'll have to keep an eye on that as well. A couple of other, things I wanted to talk about this weekend. I mean, one, I want to just talk briefly about, I feel really bad for Gabriel Bortoleto this weekend. It was an absolute disaster for him. 2 pretty major crashes, and of course that crash before the Grand Prix as well was really serious too. The 2 really big crashes that Bortoleto thankfully walked away from unharmed, but just a disastrous weekend overall. Lucas, I mean, one thing I did maybe want to touch on was we haven't really discussed him this season. And I mean, look, coming into the season, he's the reigning F2 champ. So I think actually potentially he was maybe a little bit underrated compared to some of the other rookies that were coming in. But I don't think this has been a spectacular season for Bortoleto, and this weekend really compounded how bad things can go. I think when it's your home race as well, we saw Kimi Antonelli had a really difficult home race as well. Sometimes that can get into the heads of the drivers in particular. But I mean, overall, Bortoleto this season, what do you think, Lucas? Obviously, this weekend was a complete write-off, but is he someone that potentially, has just had a very middling season this year?
Yeah, I don't think any of the rookies this season have had an ostensibly bad one, per se. No, he hasn't exactly shone as some sort of phenom that's just dropped into Formula One, has walked away with something. I mean, he's not, like I say, he's not done particularly badly, but he's not exactly shone. And the pressure from home races, as you say, with Kimi as well, it's tough. And for both the sprint and the Grand Prix to have gone so badly for him must be a real gut punch. I mean, the pressure has to be there, yes, but especially that sprint crash was really, really bad. I mean, to come down into turn one, he was going at quite the rate of knots. And I think it was just a combination of inputs that the car just was not having. Braking and turning, trying to go for that inside line, like we saw from Kimi, like we saw from actually Ollie Behrman, who I think we will touch on shortly. But that mid-engine physics just was not on his side. Went straight into the inside wall and then just carried on at full pelt into that outside wall. Granted, again, we saw him walk away from it and he was completely fine, which was arguably miraculous. I think that was one of the scariest crashes of the year. And I mean, if the home race pressure wasn't getting in his head as it was, to have that sort of accident in the sprint race definitely would have put him on tilt for the Grand Prix itself. And granted, the Grand Prix crash wasn't quite as spectacular as that sprint race was. But still, it did come across as a little bit of a skill problem. Yes, it was with Lance Stroll, who did push him out towards the edge, but he wasn't really there alongside to begin with anyway. And it was a push that he quite easily could have recovered from. I mean, granted, he did touch onto the wet stuff, and that's what essentially spun him out. But at the end of the day, if he'd backed off, if he'd taken a beat, he may have been able to come out of that unscathed and go on to complete the race, which I think is a real shame. I think a lot of it can be chalked up to pressure and just circumstances for this weekend, but I don't think it means that overall this year he's had a bad one. I think he's been in a car that nobody considers is, great by any stretch of the imagination, but is still... he's not impressed, but he's not quite disappointed. So I think it's somewhere in the middle.
I actually disagree a little bit. I think he's actually had a really good season. I think he's been one of the standout rookies. I think perhaps there's a bit of recency bias with Ollie Behrman. Obviously, he's had two fantastic weekends. But I do think that Gabriel Bortoleto has been one of the more consistent rookie drivers. Let's not forget he started the year with an absolutely terrible car. Sauber started the season, they had the slowest car on the grid. And they've improved that. With some big upgrade packages, they managed to get the car into a good place, and they've scored good results and have been, regularly featuring in the points and particularly in the second half of the season. And he's been there. He's been scoring consistent points for them and some great results and some great drives along the way. Obviously, Hulkenberg sort of took that headline grabbing result at Silverstone with the podium. That was, there was an element of fortune involved in that, and he as a result, his points total is so large compared to Bortoleto. So maybe if you're just looking at it on paper, yes, I think Bortoleto is maybe 18th or 19th in the Drivers' Championship.
Yeah, he's currently 19th, obviously, after Franco Colapinto and Jack Doohan as well. Yeah. So
you look at results on paper and you think, oh, maybe, Bortoleto's not having a good season, but I don't think that's a fair reflection of actually how well he's performed and how consistent he's been alongside, a highly rated, very experienced Nico Hulkenberg, who is no slouch, and we know how good he is. And Bortoleto at times has been outperforming him. Okay, look, maybe he took too many risks this weekend, trying to impress, particularly on home soil. His first Brazilian Grand Prix, it's very easy to get swept up in all the hype and excitement around that. And obviously, he's going to want to perform. he's a little bit unlucky with the sprint race, because actually the lap prior to his crash, I think it was one of the racing balls. He pulled off that move that he attempted on the lap prior to his huge accident. And, second time he tries it, it doesn't work off, and it's a huge accident, obviously. And then, the Grand Prix is disappointing. First lap collision out of the race. But again, I actually think he's shown that consistency throughout the year in a very bad car at times. And he has been consistent and scored those points. And I think it's quite easy to sort of look at it from the outside and think, he's 19th in the championship. He's not having a great season. But I'd actually argue that he's been up there probably with Isaac Hadjar as arguably the most impressive rookie. When you take the year as a whole collectively and you consider where the drivers are in their, relative machinery, I think he's actually having a very good season.
Yeah, we're getting into a really interesting point, Lewis, in the championship where the rookies are all actually really finding their feet. So I think that is probably a good point, that Bortoletta's actually probably been quite solid throughout the season, despite having, a really bad car. I don't think that Sauber is nearly as bad as it was at the start. It's definitely improved now, and it is able to fight for good position. But you're right, he has been jostling for some of those positions as well. And Nico Hülkenberg is having an incredible season this year as well. So
sorry, just to add to that as well, when was the last time you remember Gabriel Bortoleto making a mistake or having a big crash? This week,
that's true. And like I say, I don't think he's had a bad season by any stretch of the imagination. And I think you're right in that consistency is key here. And in the machinery that he's been placed in, he's done pretty well. He has done pretty well, all things considered. And relative to the other rookies, I think you're right there too.
Yeah, well, on that, let's stick with some of the rookies then, Lewis, because I think actually what you've touched on is there important as well, is perhaps as well we might have just seen some of these kind of odd blistering performances from some of the rookies, and that's potentially dominating the headlines, and that kind of gives a perception that, that these rookies are these new rising stars. So I think it'll be really interesting to see as well if Audi have a, somewhat competitive car next year. I think there's been a lot of chatter about that, and actually, obviously Audi has underplayed everything massively, but, under the leadership of Mattia Binotto, there's been some whispers that they actually might be more competitive than people are saying. I'm not saying that they're going to be coming in and fighting for podiums next year, but I mean, the fact that outfit is already operating at a much better level than it was this time 12 months ago means that there's progress there. And then when they have their own engine, it will be, an interesting way to see which direction that team takes them. But ultimately, I think it's all to play for Audi. And as you say, they've kept Bortoleto and Nico Hülkenberg, so it's a decent lineup next year. But just going back to the rookies question then, Lewis, then obviously we had another brilliant performance from Ollie Behrman this weekend. P6, I think it was Haas's best result ever in Brazil. There was some kind of whispers of, a bit of commentary during the week about, Ferrari need to be, jumping on him as soon as one of their drivers go. I think it's kind of a moot point at this stage. They've locked in two of their drivers, so it's not going to happen anytime soon. But I mean, a really impressive performance from Ollie Behrman, some really daring moves throughout the weekend. But Lewis, I think ultimately what I wanted to get at is he someone that could potentially make a jump to maybe another higher team before Ferrari has that position to say, well, we're going to swap out our drivers, because they've locked down their two drivers, for the next few years at least. Lewis kind of said, I've got a pretty long contract with Ferrari as well. We know Charles has one too. Now that can always change, but there's always this talk about, Behrman will go to Ferrari because he was the Ferrari development driver, that kind of thing as well. But I mean, is he someone that potentially, another big team could be eyeing up in a couple of years?
Yeah, potentially. I think if he continues these performances, then other teams will be looking at him. But I think ultimately he is a Ferrari young driver, and there's a clear pathway there for him. He's on a 2-year sort of effective loan deal to Haas at the moment, so we believe that covers next season as well. So he'll be staying there. I don't think he'll be going anywhere before 2027, unless Hamilton decided to suddenly quit or something unforeseen happened, and he'd probably then move up to Ferrari. He has already made his debut for Ferrari, let's not forget. But I think a bit like George Russell, sort of introduction to F1, he'd probably benefit from having another season at Haas, just to sort of hone that craft and gain more experience in a less pressured environment. But also, to gain that consistency, because I think that's one thing where, as I touched on before, with sort of Gabby Bortoleto has been more consistent than say, Ollie Behrman, who's had those sort of headline-grabbing results, particularly in the last 2 weekends. And that's not to discredit any of his performances. The last 2 weekends, he's been absolutely phenomenal and driven superbly to finish fourth and sixth. But Haas have also, brought upgrades. I think they brought a big upgrade at the US Grand Prix that's kind of transformed their end to the season, and they're now sort of, looking at potentially fighting for that sixth place in the Constructors' Championship, making sort of a late push for it. And we've seen that their performance has improved. And Behrman has been brilliant and executed those performances to get those incredible results for the team. But I think, he has had a bit of a mixed season as well. There's, I think China stands out as being at one of his particularly strong weekends early on in the year. And then, he's had those kind of ups and downs where he's clearly had the raw potential and pace, and he's shown glimpses of how good he can be. And then he's also had some scrappier weekends, some messy weekends where he's made some errors and perhaps, finished lower than he should have. But he definitely, he's on a great run at the moment. He's got the momentum behind him. Maybe a bit like sort of Kimi Antonelli, he's sort of finding his feet now and sort of coming of age. And I think it's that consistency side that we need to see from Ollie Behrman now. And it's very easy, isn't it, to get swept up in all the hype, particularly after Mexico and again in Brazil. Everyone's looking at that Ferrari drive and thinking, he's ready for it. And there's been a lot of talk about that in the last couple of weekends. And I think he would be if the opportunity arose. I think we've seen that he's got that pace and talent to compete at the front of the grid, or at least in that top front end, maybe very front. But I don't see that happening anytime soon unless Hamilton decided he'd had enough or whatever it was. But I think he just needs, another season at Haas, I think, will be great for him ultimately, for it to just further his career. And then he will, I believe he will ultimately probably take that seat that currently is occupied by Hamilton at some stage in the future. It's not exactly like there's a rush to be in that Ferrari based on car.
I was going to say, if another team offers him a seat, he should probably take it.
Yeah.
I suppose. Well, on that point, sort of, where does he go? I don't
it won't
see.
It won't be for 2026, whatever happens.
No, this is the thing. All the big teams are locked down for the next few years. So I think the only potential way, if something crazy happened at McLaren, where one of those drivers got fed up with a title fight or something like that, between the two drivers of preference, it's the only potentially kind of opening I could see there. But then also McLaren has, some good ties with a lot of drivers as well. So it's probably quite unlikely as well. They have a lot of options to go from there as well.
I think 2027 the market's going to explode, isn't it? And I think you're looking there at, there's so much movement that could potentially happen. Should next year be good for Ferrari and Hamilton kind of regain that spark or something, and he decides he wants to continue and has that option to for 2027 beyond, and maybe that opening isn't there at Ferrari, then maybe 2027 potentially Behrman needs to assess his future options. But there's a lot of if, buts and maybes involved there. And there's even a team like Aston Martin, for example, could be looking for that next best thing, particularly with Alonso. It's not getting any younger, is he? At 44 now, is he? And only contract till the end of next season, so he's got a big decision to make next year. Aston Martin have a big decision to make in terms of the future of their team and the sort of driver they want to hopefully be fighting for their to match their lofty ambitions of fighting at the front of the grid and fighting for world championships in the coming years. So I think 2027 is the bigger question mark there. He's locked into Haas next season. I think it just depends whether that opening does come at Ferrari, which probably suggests one of two things. Either Hamilton's decided to retire after winning an 8th world championship and Ferrari have absolutely aced the new regulations, which seems quite hard to picture at the moment, or he has decided to retire because he's had enough and decides to call it a day, and then perhaps there's that opening at Ferrari. But otherwise, then I think it becomes a question of what does Behrman do, because maybe another season performing like this for Haas, perhaps he then feels ready for that step up to a team further up the grid and would warrant it if that were the case.
Yeah, this tends to happen where we have a year where the driver market is absolutely explosive. There's so much movement, and then the following year is very static, and it tends to be, kind of a few changes here or there, and it kind of takes time again for things to kind of explode again. But I agree. I think that Behrman is someone that I think top teams will be watching. I think obviously Ferrari are comfortable to have a driver like that on their books, which is great, but because there's so many unknowns next year as well. You mentioned Aston Martin, Lewis, and whether Fernando Alonso stays on beyond next year is very questionable at this point as well. So there could be some really competitive teams in there. Who knows? Maybe Alpine will return to the Benetton glory days and their early Renault days and be, a championship threat again, and they'll be looking for a young driver to take over. But really quickly, just to finish off, Lucas, I wanted to really briefly talk about Yuki Tsunoda. I mean, finishing last in that race after Max has arguably his best performance of the year. I think the question isn't whether he's with Red Bull at this point next year. I do wonder, is he on the grid period next year?
Yeah, it's not looking great, is it? I mean, throughout the year we've been talking about this gulf in performance between the two Red Bull drivers for what reasons at this point are pretty much irrelevant. But we saw them both way down the grid out of position. We saw Max starting from the pit lane, and yet here we are with this massive gulf again, with Yuki still sitting pretty much plumb last, and Max completely running away. In equal machinery, it speaks for itself, and there's not really much debate to be had anymore. Yeah, I don't really see him going back to the V-Carbs. I mean, I don't think you do either. We've had this discussion before. As for where he does go, nobody seems to really be placing that much stock in him right now, just because these performances keep happening week in and week out, or should I say, don't keep happening week in, week out. It's a real shame. Consistency is there, but it's just the wrong kind of consistency. And yeah, it's going to be tricky for him to be finding any sort of seat next year, I reckon.
I can't see him staying at this rate. Where does he go? The only option, I think we pretty much can rule out at this stage that he's going to stay on at Red Bull next season based on his current performance and everything we've heard about Isaac Hadjar, most likely getting that drive for next year. Then it's a case of at Racing Bulls, and there's, it's been mooted that they're lining up Arvid Lindblad from F2 to take one of those seats, and then it's a straight shootout between Tsunoda and Liam Lawson. And again, this weekend, Liam Lawson puts in a great performance and delivers points. And, both drivers, Hadjar and Lawson, performed well this weekend, but it was particularly Lawson, I thought, that was impressive to come through and get points in the Grand Prix. And, when Lawson's kind of making that case to stay on, there's zero reason to get rid of Lawson the way he's performing at the moment. And Tsunoda, it's just kind of getting worse and worse. And yeah, just another rotten weekend for him. I just don't see him having a full-time race seat next season. I think I mentioned it before in the previous podcast that maybe he looks to try and get a reserve role or development role at Aston Martin potentially. I mean, they've already announced their reserve driver for next year, but perhaps he could become one of those options too, with the links to Honda, which is, some believe the main reason he's still at Red Bull and within their family is the Honda link, his main backers, and they're obviously severing ties with Red Bull at the end of this year. So that kind of link has gone, and yeah, I just don't. I think ultimately for his career as well. I mean, sadly, looks like he might not be in the grid next season, but I think he'd probably be best served leaving the Red Bull family and trying to find an in somewhere else, and perhaps that could come at Aston Martin or another team. But yeah, I just can't see Tsunoda staying on at this rate.
Yeah, they've they made the difficult decision, I think, to stick with Yuki throughout the year, and I think that was a clear statement from the team to move away from the past driver chaos that they've had before. It was very much saying, we've made our bed, now we're going to lie in it. I think that Lauren Mekis has been really, really pushing that point. But ultimately, I mean, it is just insane to think how much more competitive Red Bull would be if they had a better second driver in that seat. They would probably be clearly in P2 in the constructors at this point. The fact that Max is just carrying that team to the levels that it is already is just simply stunning. And you know, they could have made McLaren's life a little bit harder in the driver's title too if you had another driver there, you know, supporting Max throughout some of the weekends too as well. I often think sometimes that if Max didn't lose the head in Spain, that, you know, this could be even closer again. And, you know, if you had that a better result from Max that weekend and a better second driver, you know, it would have been a lot more competitive between McLaren and Red Bull throughout the year. And I think the writing's on the wall at this point. Not only is he not going to be with Red Bull next year, he isn't going to be on the grid. And I think, Lewis, you touched on a really good point. Like, both Lawson and Hadjar have been putting in really good performances, particularly over the last couple of weekends. They've both been so consistent, and actually maybe that's causing a bit of a headache for Red Bull as well, where they're thinking, you know, yeah, let's keep Lawson on, and then do we kind of eye him up as another potential to get him back into the top seat at one point? Now, I still think Hadjar has been the better driver, and you know, I think it's pretty clear cut that he will be in that other seat, but the fact that he's improving is probably good news to them as well, that they have that second driver on the books that they want to keep there too as well. And he'll be a good benchmark for Arvid Lindblad if he joins the grid next year. He'll have a good teammate to go up against there as well. So yeah, the Red Bull driver dilemma just keeps trundling on weekend after weekend. Well, that's all we have time for this week, folks. No race next weekend, but we'll be back for Las Vegas in a couple of weeks' time. Until then, make sure you head over to crash.net for all the latest F1 news and analysis. And until Vegas, thank you for listening.